Hello, and welcome to the Treba Technologies Security Plus course. My name is Johnny Bandon, and I will be your instructor for this video series. This video will cover Domain 2.4, Authentication and Authorization. Now let's get started. So I want to preface this video by saying that it's going to be a long one, right? So we have 18 slides to go over, and authentication authorization methods, there's a lot that goes into it. So I understand if you can't sit there and retain information over a 30-minute video. So please feel free to pause, take a break, and then come back to us. And let's go ahead and learn about some authentication authorization. So the first authentication method we're going to go over is LDAP. So authentication methods are essential in your enterprise. And the most common authentication and authorization method used in enterprise is LDAP. This is the backend protocol that's used for services like Active Directory domain services. LDAP is going to provide directory services for your enterprise in a hierarchical fashion. So let's just take a look at this, right? So this is like an Active Directory domain. We have our domain controller, right? Or a DC, and that's example.com. And then you have different organizational units. And then you have canonical names in those OUs or the objects in Active Directory. And you can see that this is a hierarchical designed service or authentication method, right? So we're not going to dive, this isn't a Microsoft course, so we're not going to dive too deep on Active Directory. But we need to know that LDAP is going to provide domain services and authentication and authorization. All right, moving on to our next slide. So another authentication method or concept we're going to use is federation. So you use federation for stuff like single sign-on, and what federation offers is the ability to use identity providers, right, called IDPs. Those are our identity providers, to authenticate clients against their servers for our own service or website or application. For example, a website can create an API call to interact with Google's authentication servers. And in this case, Google would be the IDP, the identity provider. And they're going to use that API to allow users to sign in to their own website using their Google credentials. For example, my website, I created an API call to Google Cloud Services, and that API authenticates my website to be able to use Google's authentication servers. And we're going to deep dive into this a little more later on in the series, where we go over OpenID and OAuth and SAML. These are different protocols that we use for federation. But federation as the concept, right, just allows you to use identity providers, okay? So that's the important thing to note on this section of the Sec Plus exam objectives. Another form of authentication that is used in our enterprises is time-based one-time passwords. And these can be used for extra authentication on our users' credentials. An example of this is for a regular user to use the Google Authenticator app to give a second form factor to authenticate into an application or service, right? And that Authenticator app is going to give a unique code for logins. So I use this myself. I have the Google Authenticator app on my phone. And for pretty much everything, I use this as a second form of authentication, where it gives you a one-time code to be used, and that one-time code expires after a certain amount of time. I think it's 15, 30, or 60 seconds for the Google Authenticator app, but not really sure. And the Authenticator app is talking to that Authenticator server, which is going to give it that one-time code. Next, let's go over another second form of authentication, or another authentication method, is text messages, right? So we've all probably used this before if we have second factor authentication on our social media. If we log into a new device, we may need to use or get a code sent to our phone numbers and use that code to authenticate into an application or service. Another authentication method we have is a token key. So a token key is a physical hardware device that can be used as a second form of authentication. So you have these UB keys right here that people use, where you plug that in via USB to either your devices or here to your iPhone or your Android device, and that's going to allow you to have a second form, right? This actual hardware device. We also have RSA tokens that I've used personally before in the enterprise. When I want to get into a networking device, this RSA token key will generate a 6-digit code for me to use for authentication. And again, a lot of this stuff you can just keep on your keys and you can implement this, right? For anything, your Google account, your Microsoft account. And then we have push notifications, or excuse me, we have static codes. What static codes are a list of codes that can be copied or downloaded to your desktop and also used as a second form. So typically, this is going to be used when, let's say, you lost access to your phone for text messages, you lost access to Authenticator app, you don't have your UB key anymore. So your last resort is these static codes or these recovery codes, right? Um, a lot of times when you do crypto, when I got my Coinbase wallet or my Binance, right, I'll have a static codes that I saved into a encrypted database on my computer that have these static codes. And now let's talk about push notifications. So push notifications are something or another form of second factor authentication that can be used to authenticate you to a new device, right? So we see an example here on the screen. Login request, tap to see the request in the app. So I use this with Gmail as well. Anytime I log in to my Gmail account from a new device that isn't trusted, I'm going to get a push notification on my cell phone, which is a trusted device, right? And on that trusted device, I'm going to push, yes, that was me, or it may give me a number to choose saying which number is showing up on the untrusted device that you're trying to log into, right? Push notifications can also be used for banking, right? So let's say you spent over the normal amount you usually spend on your credit card. Maybe you bank with Wells Fargo. They'll send you a text message or a push notification on the app saying, was this you and did you charge this large amount of money onto your card? And then we have smart cards. So smart cards are used for identification, authentication. They're going to contain user credentials. Smart cards are typically integrated into a PKI system. PKI standing for the public key infrastructure, which we will talk about later on in the series. And they are a form of two factors of authentication, meaning that smart card is usually accompanied with a PIN. So you'll have that smart card that's in your possession, and you'll also have to use a PIN or a password to actually authenticate fully using that smart card. Sometimes smart cards are also called tokens. In this section of the Sec Plus exam, they just go over smart cards as a form of authentication. And now let's go over multi-factor authentication as the concept, right? So multi-factor authentication delivers better security for your enterprise by not placing a single point of failure on just a username and password combination, right? Those can be brute force, those can be exposed, those can leave you vulnerable. So what multi-factor authentication is going to do is give you several different ways to authenticate or log in to a service, application, or the enterprise. So we have our example on the screen here. You go ahead and give that username and password. And then on your trusted device, this phone, we got a push notification, which is our second factor. And once you hit yes there, that is you, you're now logged into that service, application, or to your credentials. So now let's go over the different multi-factor factors, right? So there are 3 different factors that the Security Plus exam wants you to know when dealing with MFA, multi-factor authentication. So the first one is something you know. The something you know factor is something the user creates or and only they should know of. For example, usernames, passwords, pins, or even security questions are something you know factor. So think of this as something you made up, right? If you made your own pin or your own password, that's something only you should know. And then with these security questions, I don't really like this as a second form, right? And Security Plus looks at this as one factor: pins, passwords, something you know. And why is that? Because essentially it's all the same thing. And with security questions, I really don't like them because through some reconnaissance of someone's social media, you can find out their childhood best friend's name, right? That's a common one. You can find out their fiance. Some people's social media, you'll find out the day they started dating, which also is also a second security question answer, right? So through some social media reconnaissance, you can find out a lot of this information. So I don't like using this on my enterprises as a second form or even a factor at all. But moving on, right? That's just my opinion, but the Security Plus exam wants you to know about these different factors. So the something you have factor. Something you have is something that is given to the user that they must be accountable for. This is like tokens, smart cards, or even maybe a cellular device. These are all examples of something you have. So something physically in your possession. And then we have something you are. So something you are is something biological to your body and unique to you. This is referring to something called biometrics. And biometrics is something you are born with and cannot be replicated by another person. So we're talking Face ID, right? Fingerprint scanning, retina, voice prints, or the facial recognition again, right? Sometimes even your unique patterns, the way you walk, the way you type, can be something you are. This is something biological, something biologically unique to you. And then we have attributes. So along with the three main factors, there are other MFA attributes the Security Plus exam wants you to know. Somewhere you are is an attribute that can be signed to your user account, like a geolocation using GPS. So an example of this is something called geofencing, where maybe if you're handing out cellular devices, right, you have a maybe like a COPE or you have a BYOD policy. Maybe you could put a geofence around the compound your users work at, where they're only allowed to use enterprise resources within that geofence. That is a somewhere you are attribute. And then we have something you can do, which is an attribute very similar to something you know, but this is going to require motor skills. So the most common one is that Android swipe unlocking feature, right? That is something you can do. Or maybe this is a picture where on the website it asks you, hey, put this missing puzzle piece into this puzzle. So you have to click it and drag it over and match it up. That is something you can do attribute. And then we have something you exhibit. Also falls in line with the something you are factor, but to your specific patterns. So, like your walking speed or how you walk, patterns in your voice. And then lastly, someone you know. This is going to be another attribute used when you have a trusted relationship with someone that can authenticate you. Kind of like an emergency contact. You don't see this being used a lot just for simple apps and services, but when you go to the doctor, right? And maybe you're unconscious, someone you know can identify you, right? Now let's go over AAA. So AAA stands for Authentication, Authorization, and Accounting. And there are three technology concepts that are used to determine a user's identity, their privilege level, and the actions they perform on the network. And when we separate these three concepts and implement them, we can build a robust security policy for our users and integrate technologies that support AAA. So right now, we're not going to talk about technologies that support AAA. That would be something like TACX, Radius, right? .1x. Right now, we're just going over the concepts and what these terms mean. So authentication, that's just verifying a user's identity. You told your enterprise your John.Bandon is your username and your password is password. When you're authenticated, that's the service, that authentication server telling you, yes, that is you because you matched up with my database that has that same username, that same password. Then authorization is going to be your privilege level access. So once you authenticate onto the enterprise, right? Maybe you're using Active Directory, right? Just as an example. And now once you're authenticated, we're going to apply policies to your account that say, okay, the username John.Bandon, he can go in and troubleshoot and manage the Exchange server, but he is hands off the file server. So authorization, the term describes granting account access and privileges. And then accounting is going to be our logging, right? This tracks the account's usage, resources, and performs logging. So for my guys with a network background, TACX, right? You can use a TACX server like ICE for Cisco, the ICE server, and log what people are doing on your network devices that log in. That is called accounting, keeping a user account accountable for the actions on the network. And let's go over biometrics now. So biometrics fall under the something you are factor, and they describe your unique biology and how we can use your biology to authenticate you. Even personal devices now, like iPhones or Android phones, use biometrics into their authentication using stuff like Face ID or the thumbprint. So now let's get into some actual biometric technologies. So fingerprint scanning is going to check the unique patterns and ridges and valleys in your fingerprints. Governments have long used fingerprints to identify a person, right? And then we have retina scanning. Retina scanning uses the patterns of a blood vessel in your retina. Retina scanning is considered an intrusive form of authentication, but it has a low false positive rate, meaning it's very accurate if you're doing retina scannings. And then we have iris recognition, which uses patterns in infrared imaging to identify an individual's eyes. So this is considered less intrusive, and this really just deals with how deep the scan has to go and how close your eye has to be to the scanner. And then, of course, we have facial recognition, a common biometric used today. Essentially, a database will store multiple pictures of your face and then compare your current reading to authenticate you. Now, don't be scared or alarmed. In Apple iPhones, facial recognition, that database is just stored in your phone, so they say, right? When you get your iPhone, you know it takes that facial recognition and builds that baseline. Now we got other ones here like voice recognition, which relies on the patterns of an individual's voice for authentication. Then we have vein recognition, which matches the patterns of a person's veins. And then gait analysis, which is a measurement of how a person walks to properly identify them. All right. So with biometric technologies, there is always a possibility of false results, right? So even though it's something unique to your body, technology is not infallible, right? You can have errors or false positives in the system. And we call this the FRR or the FAR. Now let's get into this. So FRR stands for false rejection rate and measures the number of times an authorized person is denied access. So the false rejection rate is essentially false negatives or type 1 error, right? Going into the book. But what it means is I have access to the SCIF with my fingerprints or my TS area. But for some reason, the system at the door won't let me in. It's denying me access even though I do have access. That's the false rejection rate. FAR stands for false acceptance rate, and it will measure the number of times an unauthorized person was granted access. So I bought the Fast Pass at an amusement park, right? So I'm good to go. But my buddy who didn't, he tries using his regular pass, and he's granted access into the Fast Pass line. That is false acceptance rate. Someone who's unauthorized but was granted access. And then we have CER, which stands for the crossover error rate. The crossover error rate is a way to quantify both the FAR and FRR as a line graph, right? So what do I mean by this? When the FIR goes up, the FAR goes down, and vice versa. So the higher our false rejection rate is, the lower our false acceptance rate is. And it works vice versa, right? When the two FAR and FIR lines meet on this line graph where we're quantifying it, that is called the crossover error rate, which is where we want our systems to be. We don't want a super high FIR, super low FAR. We want them to be somewhere in the middle where they meet on our graph. So let's take a look at that. So this is the crossover error rate chart, right? Where they meet in the middle. That's where we want our biometric systems to be, right here. All right, so that is all I have for this video. I want to thank you for viewing and stay tuned for our next video where we'll be going over domain 2.5, resilience and redundancy. Thank you for viewing.